Thank you for joining me for my first God, Law, and Liberty podcast to be posted on the Fight, Laugh, Feast network since my retirement, December the 31st. And today I think is going to be a very revealing show, particularly for those of you who are hearing about the revival of natural law thinking as a basis for contending for public policies, truth, the legitimization of public authority in the public square. I had a friend that recently attended a meeting of, well, I won't say, but a national organization of great repute. And someone spoke there on natural law and said he was treated like a god. It's like, this is so brilliant. But I have some serious reservations about it, and I want to explain those today. And I think it'll be very eye-opening because I don't think that effort will produce the fruit that that is hoped for. Now, a couple of things before I get into that. First of all my commentaries and podcasts will also be on my Substack page, senatorfowler94.substack.com. That's senatorfowler94.substack.com. Now, what I've been doing in this my first week of retirement is cutting some short little podcast videos, 4 or 5 minutes long, and posting it along with the transcript and sending it out to my subscribers. It's free. You can subscribe for free. You can support the work if you want to, but just get the information and share the information. And what I'll probably be doing on the Fight, Laugh, Feast network is continuing to post once a week a longer podcast, okay? But let me encourage you to go to that website because we've been working through in short snippets, how does a Christian today legitimate authority? We've been looking specifically at the authority of public officials, but if you are a parent, let me just say you need to be following this discussion as well, because next in the crosshairs will be the parental rights that you think you have from God that you don't have anymore. And we'll explain that, and we'll talk about how to get them back. But today I want to explain why I think natural law is going to be unintelligible in the thought discussions of our day. Okay? One of the things that I ran across or came back to the other day was C.S. Lewis's statement in his third part of what's often considered mere Christianity, where he talks about we don't like to think about doctrine, and we like to keep things simple, and we like to keep things practical. But he makes this statement: theology is practical, especially now. And keep in mind when he's writing this. In the old days, when there was less education and discussion, perhaps it was possible to get on with a very few simple ideas about God. But it is not so now. In other words, if we don't appreciate the nature of the conversations that are taking place in the public square, particularly among our thought leaders that are taking place on the other side of the aisle, so to speak, from the Christian in the political endeavors, on the other side of the bench in the courtroom, then we can never be the sons of Issachars that we need to be, because we don't understand the conversation and we won't know how to participate in it, and our talk will just be jabber, so much like Charlie Brown in Snoopy's ears, blah, 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 blah. Okay? And in fact, I've mentioned this book several times. In Carl Becker's book, written I think in 1931, The Heavenly City of the 18th Century Philosophers, he says that logic isn't as much important anymore as it is the climate of opinion. In other words, we live in an atmosphere of certain beliefs, and those beliefs filter the information we get to determine whether they're true or not. And logic may not apply. In fact, I'm going to suggest to you today that both inductive and deductive logic are dead. And that's a problem because apart from belief in revelation, inductive and deductive logic are the only two bases upon which we thought man could reason to conclusions. So this is very, very important. And the point here that he makes in his book is that Thomas Aquinas made great sense when he wrote, because he wrote into a discussion in which it was assumed there was a divinely ordered cosmos and all things held together, right? And so he made sense. But when he's saying, but today, he says that's just not true. We can read him and we can appreciate all of his efforts and the logic of his arguments, but we really don't know how to respond to them because we don't share his assumptions. And see, for deductive logic to work, you have to start with certain premises or predicates that are either proven true or assumed to be true so that you can reach a conclusion. But here's the point. The conclusion that you reach can only say the argument that you're making is valid or invalid. It can't say the argument is true or false. And here's what I mean by that. Let's assume that you say public officials have legitimate authority. God alone has authority. Conclusion, therefore, the authority of public officials comes from God, and that's what makes it legitimate. Now, that would be a valid argument, but we can't say it's true or false. What if we don't believe that they have legitimate authority? What if we don't believe there's a God? What if we say we can't know anything about God? What if we believe that there are two powers in the world and they're fighting against each other, so there's not just one God? So we could agree that that's a valid argument. And we could look at Thomas Aquinas and his natural law kinds of concepts and say, well, those are valid arguments, but we don't believe those things anymore. You see? So we can't say that they're true. We can't say that they're false. We just don't know what to make of them. And therein is going to lie the problem of natural law arguments today. Now, let me explain what has fundamentally changed that has made thinking in this world, from our perspective, irrational. Inductive doesn't work, deductive doesn't work. Now, let me start with inductive. Inductive reasoning is the idea that you can take a bunch of facts, and from those facts you can reach a conclusion by inducement that, well, there must be a law of gravity. Okay? But ultimately, Albert Einstein, pretty smart scientist, wrote in his book, the metaphysical, well, not in his book, but I found the quote in the Metaphysical Foundations of American History. It's actually in the book he wrote later in his life. I think it's entitled Out of My Later Years. But Einstein wrote this: there is no inductive method which could lead to the fundamental concepts of physics. What? Yeah. The reality is, as they began to look into the subatomic particles, they began to see things that they didn't expect. And all of a sudden, they weren't sure of all the conclusions they thought they were sure about. Yes, we can talk in terms of a law of gravity, but all we're really saying is it's a probability that if you're holding an apple and you let it go, it's going to fall to the ground. But we can't say that that is a law that's unavoidable and must at all times and in all ways hold true. Okay? So this is what's interesting, and it pertains to common law, and I hope this will make sense. But I was thinking back to the introduction to my copy of William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, and it's written by Stanley Kurtz, I think is his name, but But here's what he writes that's very fascinating. The substance of Book 1 of the commentaries begins with Section 2 on the nature of laws in general. Okay, so Blackstone's given us a general understanding of law. I've quoted that many, many times. Law is, a rule of action prescribed by a superior by which the inferior is bound, and we see in nature that there are things that are bound by certain laws, and if they fail to conform to those laws, they cease to exist or don't function properly. And man, being a creature, he has to conform to the laws of his maker. And he says, so with respect to that, he says it's a brief and unconvincing essay on the natural law background of the English legal system. So all of those who are wanting to say, let's return to natural law, you need to consider why he would say it's an unconvincing exercise. In fact, he says this: it's an obligatory 18th century exercise in which Blackstone accords to natural and revealed law about the same importance that Newton accorded to God and the operation of the physical universe. When I first read that, I didn't fully get what that meant. But let me share it with you. Again, looking at some statements from Becker's book, The Heavenly City of the 18th Century Philosophers. This is what he said. Newton, more than any other man, had banished mystery from the world by discovering a universal law of nature, thus demonstrating what others had only asserted, that the universe was rational and intelligible through and through, and capable, therefore, of being subdued to the uses of men. But what happened was this, and let me read it to you from this book by Gary North. It's the last book that he published, The Biblical Structure of History. And he's writing here about the fact that history is no longer considered objective or trying to convey or get at some meaning. The idea that we would call providence, that there's something going on here. What is really going on beyond the facts themselves? See, that's a metaphysical kind of analysis of history, that there's some meaning behind it, which of course would be a very Christian idea. But here's what he said happened to objective history, and this is what happened to law, and this is why natural law isn't going to work anymore, at least not in the conversation we're engaged in. North writes this: a neglected cause of the loss of faith in objective history, and I would say objective law, objective standards for law, that we could deduce from the things we observe, for example, came from the Copenhagen School of Physics in the 1920s. Quantum physics. That movement had declared that the realm of subatomic physics is not governed by the same Newtonian laws of cause and effect that govern the realm of atoms where you and I live. This change began to affect the social sciences, and interestingly, the one that North cites is law. One influential scholar who understood the impact of quantum physics outside of physics department was Roscoe Pound, who was the dean of the Harvard Law School from 1916 to 1937. After this, he became a university professor at Harvard. In 1940, he wrote this in his book, Contemporary Juristic Theory. Nothing has been so upsetting to political and juristic thinking as the growth of the idea of contingency in physics. It has taken away the analogy from which philosophers had reached the very idea of the law. It has deprived political and juristic thought of the pattern to which they had conceived of government and law as set up. Physics had been the rock on which they had built. Now, what's he saying here? When we got rid of the notion of God, when Newton established a universal law from looking at the facts and said, well, this is a law of nature, he said, well, we can deduce law for human civilizations, for human beings from nature as well. But here's what happened. This is what Becker writes. The vision of man and his world is a neat and efficient machine. See, that's the result of how people took Newton. Newton didn't intend to have people think of the world as just a cosmic machine or a machine. No, he thought there was a God behind it still. But they took what he used in science to arrive at this universal law, and they said, well, actually, the world's a machine. And if the world's a machine, we can deduce all kinds of things because that's the premise for our deductive thinking. So again, let me repeat this. The vision of man and his world is a neat and efficient machine designed by an intelligent author of the universe gradually faded away. See, that's what North was talking about. Quantum physics exploded the idea that we could even have inductive reasoning, let alone the world was a machine and therefore we had an objective, solid foundation from which to deduce that there would be laws governing human nature. It was all exploded. And he said, so professors of science ceased to speak with any assurance of laws of nature. And that's why, to be honest, my friends, we can't decide what it means to be human, because that's something beyond mere matter. That's why we can't decide what it means to be male and female, because those facts of anatomy are just bare facts. They don't have any meaning. And here's what Einstein said about inductive reasoning, which is the very kind of reasoning that we have some Christians wanting to employ, that, well, if you just look at the facts, you can deduce that this is a male, you can deduce this is a female, this is a human being, this is just, this is unjust. He says, no. Einstein said there is no inductive method which could lead to fundamental concepts of physics. And the author of this book on metaphysical foundations says this: completely exploded is the notion that nature is a structure of given entities that are intrinsically meaningful, independent of the human mind. The facts are not in themselves equivalent to knowledge. They're just facts. And he says they only have meaning, he continues in the book, saying, only as organized by man and as organized as ideas and meanings that are conceptual. So everything now is ideology, and everything's conceptual, because there is no absolute that we're absolutely sure of anymore. And in the discussions and in the thinking of our world, in the climate of opinion in which we live, God is one of the facts that you have to prove. And how do you prove an invisible God? Tough. And so the author of this book, The Metaphysical Foundations of American History, continues by noting that the way these theoretical concepts and axioms that we organize the facts by and say, okay, we're going to give it this meaning, he says that they're embodied and correlated with socially agreed upon linguistic symbols. That is, in standardized words. So see, when we believed in a divine drama that God had created, and then his acts of creating, he had given a nature to things, and they were expressed in the matter. That a man was something that was in the mind of God that preceded the realities or the matter. That the matter was giving expression to the metaphysical, the ontological meaning of being human. But if that's gone, and all you have is the facts, well, what's a his? What's a her? We have to agree on what the meaning of those words are going to be. And that's the fight right now. Given the competing worldviews, what meaning are we going to use? Are we going to keep using the meaning that was derived from this out-of-date, antiquated understanding of the cosmos? Now, you and I might think, well, it's not an outdated cosmos. But the people that are leading our discussion today, our jurists, our legislators, our presidents, even many Republicans, they don't want to be talking about this God stuff, right? It's conservative principles. It's our Tennessee principles. It's American principles. I mean, that's even in the Republican Party platform. We're going to govern by the spirit of America. Whoa, there's a Gnostic thought, isn't it? So you see, we got a deep problem. The scientists in the world, the thinkers of the world, will say inductive reasoning can't give you anything, and you can't prove God by inductive reasoning. And you may want to posit as a premise for your deductive reasoning that there's a God, but until you can prove him, I'm not going to accept that as a premise. And moreover, because we have multiple worldviews anymore, well, the arguments multiply. The thing we have to appreciate about deductive reasoning, as I said, is that it can't tell you if the conclusion is true or false, only a valid or invalid argument. So we have to appreciate that the world has changed. The cosmos in which people are doing their thinking is not the Christian one. And if we go into it thinking that, well, there's enough credibility to a Christian cosmos, there's enough purchase still in the minds of men about a divinely ordered cosmic drama, and from that we can then inductively determine things, well, that kind of natural law thinking ain't going to work in this climate. It would have worked in the days of Thomas Aquinas. But Thomas Aquinas doesn't make any sense to anybody today other than, well, yeah, his conclusions are logical, but his conclusions are valid, but we can't say they're true. Now, maybe all we're trying to do is just get people to accept that our conclusions are true. But as Christians, I want them to know God. Because only in coming to know God will they find life. Will they see the unseen? Will they see the things that are eternal? So we have to appreciate what all has changed. And so exploded when from law is the physics that had sustained it even after God became mostly irrelevant. And when that physics exploded, that's what Roscoe Pound is saying, law collapsed. And now it's every man for himself and who can get the most power, because there's no way to legitimate anybody's authority as predicated on, premised in, and resting on God. So I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast, and please join me on Substack for future episodes of God, Law, and Liberty and little daily, every few days snippets. Blessings. Bye.